Honeyshuckleex.
I'm Sackbot Barbecue.
And I'm Giggleklutz. Welcome to Collab Not Multiplayer. Did you say that already?
Yes.
Oops.
Like always.
Well, you're double welcome this episode. Come on in.
The double doors are open. And we usher you into the art gallery of our conversation.
Oh, well, yeah. You know, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that quite well. So today we're going to be talking about art. And art in general. We'll get to art in video games and video games as art in Art Part 2 in 2 weeks.
Yeah, it turns out our scope just keeps broadening, and I'm okay with that.
Well, we always guessed that this stuff would be more than one episode, because let's face it, art is difficult to talk about.
But I have to ask, Sackbot, what is a art?
Well, that's a good question, and it's one I've been contemplating and struggling with for some time. It's like, if you asked me that, perhaps even a few days ago, I might have simply said, it's like, well, perhaps it's better to think about what isn't art than what is, but we've kind of seen how that goes wrong already.
Yeah, we have.
Gatekeeping art isn't good. It's bad, actually. And making that last episode about Roger Ebert's mess, Sackbot, your critique of the stuff I was asking you to study shone a new light on that in the first place. It's not in the first place. I mean, I'd had that thought before, but yeah, thank you for the deep reminder of how you really don't want to heavily gatekeep art.
Yeah, I mean,
I can understand, some places that have art needing to have, a price tag to come see it so that stuff can be maintained. But that's different from gatekeeping culture around art.
Well, and I want to separate holding space and being able to curate a specific kind of territory versus gatekeeping a concept and access to expression. That's baloney right there. But anyway, I think Sackbot had more to say about how art is difficult to talk about or why you might not want to so hard.
well, I don't say this to make the idea that what stuff that is art, I don't at all mean to discredit how important and meaningful it can be. It's simply the defining it as a term or concept that I'm finding myself struggling with at this point. It seems like you try and clarify too much what it even is in the first place, you kind of end up missing the point, which is kind of that it can just be like anything. Like, there's no actual boundaries. Theoretically, anything at all could become art somehow, and that's one of the key things that can make it so impactful. It's like, that's another thing, it's just art doesn't necessarily have to have any recognizable meaning to it either. This is the thing, it's just the more I try and clarify what I think of it, the more I just keep listing off caveats to what I'm thinking.
And yeah, if we were using a mind map to talk about art, it would have so many branches of branches of branches leading to questions and terminals and all kinds of stuff, because it would also probably loop in on itself in all kinds of ways, because it's just complicated and there's a lot of layers.
Each branch on the tree of the concept would pretty much always end with a question mark.
Yeah, for example, we got a comment actually on the last video that mentioned Dadaism, and well, thank you for the lovely comments, people. But, it got me thinking about that whole thing again, where a lot of the foundation of this art movement was saying it's not art. And which inherently, because it gets you thinking about what is art, becomes art.
Yes. So, there's a few things that we can agree on that apply to art very broadly and generally, right? Is that art is subjective, and that art includes the act of creation or expression. For the purposes of this discussion, and most art discussions in general, art needs to have an artist. It has to be a deliberate creation of something. Someone's or something. It doesn't have to be an object, but it has to be a deliberate creation. Art is intentional. That's what makes it art.
Yeah, by someone or a group of people.
It's even if the thing itself that the art is sort of made of or comes from is something that's found, if it is not created in and of itself as art, then it becomes art if it is embraced.
Right. the example of, like, the urinal that becomes art when it's just placed in the gallery. For more information on that, it's in one of the Moriarty lectures that we referenced last episode. And I also used an example of landscapes that in and of themselves, like sunsets or starry nights, in and of themselves are beautiful and possibly awe-inspiring, but they are not art in the context of this kind of conversation.
Yeah, because they're natural phenomena.
Right.
Just because the sun creates beautiful auroras when it hits us with radiation doesn't mean it's creating art.
Right.
The sky is not an art gallery, but you can take art out of it.
Absolutely. The photography you create, and in some aspects it could be argued that the memories you make of witnessing these landscapes and this beautiful stuff in nature is art, possibly. But it has to involve human perception. It has to involve an artist or a viewer. And then the viewer, in the case of the landscape, becomes the artist.
Yeah, and we're not going to get into animal art in this because that just is very complicated.
Yeah, it is something that we at home here have talked about in preparation for this episode. Also, AI kind of falls into that territory. We don't want to get into either of those topics today. We'll put them in a box.
If we get enough interest, maybe we'll revisit that someday when we've thought about it.
Well, and when we have time, we actually have quite a backlog of things we already want to talk about. And we're playing games all the time, and we would like to actually review a few more of them.
Yeah, but I have this, figurative cardboard box here labeled someday, and we're putting AI and animal art in there.
Yeah, like, you know how I plug this podcast is I say we play single-player games together, and this is getting a little bit into not quite that.
Yes. Agreed, but I needed to do some stuff to add context to things I want to talk about.
Yeah,
I wanted to have these deep art discussions so we can start using deep art terminology, and concepts when we talk about games into the future. With having some place to direct people for more context on how these kind of discussions work and actually our take on what art is.
So if you're listening to this, we tricked you into philosophy!
This is the lecture we'll be hiding later on.
Well, I think our conversations are a little bit more fun than a general lecture. I'm just gonna say.
Just kind of making a meta joke about how this is kind of the thing in the middle that will be contextually important later on when we get back to the main topic.
Yeah, it's a meta reference to our podcast schedule.
Yeah. And I've got that whole structure in my brain, and I've got the mega arcs. It's just I'm too busy doing them to really think about meta-contextual Easter egging. It's like, what? Oh, goodness. That's a mouthful right there. All right, let's get back to art, though, because, it's not complicated enough to talk about.
We definitely haven't established that already.
All right, another note I've got here is art is intention or accident. And I mean, well, I don't even know if I want to bring this up right now.
I mean, you can turn an accident into art, but,
right.
there has to be something in addition.
Okay, now I remember what my point was around that note. It's that it's connected to artist and viewer. And sometimes what makes something art is the viewer's interpretation of it. And what I was thinking of when I was really thinking about that was sometimes people just create things for practical purposes that end up very meaningful to other people. So the intention was in the creation, yes, but the meaning was not. The meaning is accidental. That's what I was getting at, because two components of what makes art in the larger sense, we'll get to that in a little bit, is the elevation. But example, got myself sidetracked. Example of accidental art was, I was watching a long time ago a little video article about someone who was studying graffiti covering. When the city had covered graffiti, they interpreted the new blocks that were created as kind of a new art form. Now, the intention was to cover them up with matching tones as close as possible to what it looked like before, and the viewer, he was a photographer, disagreed and was now saying it's art in its own right. And so there's that layer of it too. You can disagree with his interpretation. I'm just saying that
I can see how you can use this as metaphor and have that kind of interpretation.
All I know is the guy he was interviewing who was doing the painting did not agree with him that it was art at all. He's like, no, I'm just doing my job. There is no creative expression in this at all. And in the larger context of the concept of art, sometimes the viewer holds all the power, and you don't even have a say in whether or not what you do is interpreted as art.
I mean, cataloging this is definitely a critique of our society.
Yeah.
And that falls under art very easily.
Alright, so what does art do? What is it good for?
I can't say the next line of that because it's not true.
Lots and lots of stuff.
Yes. Art makes you feel is one of the primary things. Can be positive, can be negative, can be even neutral, but there's different layers to it, right? There are some art pieces that are simply made to look aesthetically pleasing. Mm-hmm. Like this sort of way of making you feel happy or safe or just calm is a valid form of art. And equally, ones that make you feel scared or angry or upset or sad, also art. Art doesn't have to be comfortable, but but discomfort also in itself does not make art.
True. And we're gonna talk a little bit later, or we can start now, about the idea that all creative expression falls under the umbrella of art, and I would call that art with a lowercase a. All creative expression, that everything that's created, whether it's ever viewed by anyone besides the artist or not, is art. Now, some art has meaning and communication that's imbued with it, right? The artist is doing this to communicate something, and I would call that elevation.
Like, the difference between a landscape shot and a beautiful landscape shot with deforestation purposely put into the corner.
Ooh, yeah.
Effectively, you could take the same picture of a mountain and just have a little bit of extra context that completely changes it and gives it a deeper meaning to it. Like, by including something that we don't see as very aesthetically appealing, you add a layer of messaging to the piece.
Right. And of course, we're using visual art, photography, and painting, that kind of thing, as examples because they often are in art discussions. But we want to remind everybody that creative expression comes in myriad forms, more than any of us can be exposed to, because some of them will just exist in little pockets of subculture. And
yeah, like culinary art is one. And to reach broader audiences, you have stuff like TV shows can also be art. I'm thinking of The Good Place for this one, but there's more.
Well, yeah. When you're talking about elevated art, when you say
yes,
that,
yeah.
And I'm saying all of it's art.
Yes.
You know, the people who make all of these created projects are artists. Actors are artists. Writers are artists. Poets. Dancers. All of those people. The choreographer is also an artist. The lighting designer is an artist. In music, you know, people who make music are artists. And they don't call them pop artists for nothing.
But to ground it in more ones, there's also engineers are also artists, because you have to combine the practical function with the ability to look appealing as well. Like, there's art that goes into that as well.
Right. And a lot of that is craftsmanship, lowercase a art, because they're not allowed the creative expression of putting messaging into their work. They have too many practical concerns and constraints to be able to do that. It doesn't mean that they don't use their engineering skills to make elevated art in their spare time. They just often can't do it in their work for work.
Yeah, like, seeing them make some relatively, like, impractical designs that are still perfectly functional gets wild.
Agreed. Absolutely. So, what has art made you feel? How about you, Sackbot? What has art made you feel?
And it's like, it's surely been like, you know, happy and sad and angry, and I'm gonna be real hungry sometimes.
Darn you, advertisements!
I wasn't even necessarily thinking about advertisements when I say that.
I know that I've felt and made art that makes me happy and scared, contemplative, curious, lost.
I've, experienced art that's made me feel like consciously a part of the universe. In both a scary and reassuring way.
Move to say peace, right?
Yeah, it's definitely been able to overlap.
Yeah.
What about you? What have you felt?
Oh, well, my favorite thing that art does, my favorite art will have deep metaphors, often severely layered metaphors, and it'll tickle my brain. My favorite art gives me a brain buzz. And you guys, since you live with me or trapped with me, have to deal with the fallout of that. You guys know better than anything when my brain is buzzing.
Not just one bee, it's the entire hive.
Bee! Oh, yeah. It's swarming, yeah. Yeah. And I love that. I feel so alive once I've been inspired by a piece of art. Once I've been tickled by a deep metaphor that works in a piece of media. For me, it generally has to be media. I can't get a brain buzz from a singular image. It has to have much bigger context. It has to be a video game or a movie at minimum.
Yeah, this does remind me of the local art scene around here, which has facilitated you being able to see a lot of one person's artworks in a single room, for example, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of gets you thinking a lot.
Yeah, and installations do, where if you created a whole environment for me to be in, that might make my brain buzz too, but usually what the buzz about that for me is, oh my gosh, maybe I want to do that more than I'm actually really enjoying the piece as it is, and so there's different layers of inspiration, but my favorite inspiration is probably my favorite thing that art does. Especially if it's teaching me or making me question things to the point where I'm looking at my own life and my own relationship to myself differently, but also, if I get a chance to look at some sort of cultural context differently or ways that specific kinds of relationships work. It's like learning about new colors. Or new types of sound or new smells or tastes. It's just, I feel like I'm growing when I'm exposed to art that inspires me.
Art can give you the power to better understand what the world looks like from the eyes of a mantis shrimp.
Yes, it's the only thing that can. I mean, really, that's one of the things that art does, aside from make you feel, is it can express the unvoiceable. It's funny that you can do that with poetry. I love that about poetry, is that you can express things you can't put into words, you might be able to put into a lot of words. It's so funny, but things that you can show the unnameable.
Somehow talking about the thing you can't quite talk about.
Some concepts are just too big to put into words. The human experience is so vast that you can't adequately put it into spoken language. You can't. The spoken language of any type is inadequate to describe the fullness of human experience. Art gets so much closer. And my favorite art is made either over a very long period of time by a single artist or as a collaborative effort of a group of passionate people. So, do we have anything else to mention about elevation? What's the difference between somebody painting street art, just the same paintings over and over and over again for tourists, and someone who, and I'm not saying either's bad. I'm not saying anything's bad. It's but one's, versus someone who spends, 10 years working on a specific painting or a play or something that had so many layers they didn't all come together until it took a long time.
Well, one way to think about it is, there was that point in our previous episode that art in itself, if it's made with the sole purpose of marketability, that is not inherently elevation.
Right.
Just because it has that meaning to it doesn't mean that that's,
it's not excluded from elevation, but it makes it so much harder to elevate something. If you're pleasing too many masters, it can be very difficult to convey any deep meaning.
Yeah,
trying to make it as a commercial thing, as to make it marketable, it's typically going to be driven more by the things that it can't express than the things that it can.
Yeah, and similarly, advertisements themselves, it's extremely rare to have an ad that is trying to say something deeper than buy this.
Yeah. But occasionally they do.
Occasionally they do.
And sometimes the Super Bowl displays them, That's the only thing I watch the Super Bowl for. If I do, which I don't most years anymore. But my example of what elevation can be also is that, bird guano on the sidewalk is not art, but taking a picture of it and labeling it a clever title that's a political commentary or something can make it art. But the bird didn't make art. The human being observing it did.
Like, me dropping a cup is not art either. If I do something with the pieces of my broken cup, it is now art, but...
Or if the context of you dropping the cup give you a beautiful, poignant story, that story becomes art, and the cup is a part of it. But the dropping of the cup in and of itself...
is an accident.
Often. Yes.
Well, I mean, in my example, I believe I said accidentally.
Yeah, and just restating the same things. It's like, my other note here is, elevation conveys a message or expresses feelings that don't exist without the artist's intervention. So that's an important thing that art does, is it either communicates the expression of the artist in hopes of eliciting feeling in the viewer, or the observer, however, I wouldn't say you view a piece of music, but, yeah, elevation is that. So, but again, I want to be careful when we look at elevation and, really have some nuance to the idea that anybody gets to interpret for anybody else, where that line is between what's elevated, because I would say that that's the subjective thing in art. If we agree that the umbrella, lowercase a art, includes all creation, it can include all creation. There can be an argument to include all of creation under that umbrella of what art is. The line for elevation needs to be subjective, and I reminded myself of this by coming up with these 2 points. Like, if I don't sense elevation in a piece, then either 1, it's not there, no one put any elevation in it, or 2, it's not for me. It's not in a language that I understand, either because it's part of a different culture or because it's part of a life experience that I don't have.
Yeah, like, I've seen, for example, quilts. I know how to work with thread and fabric, but I do not know anything about any deeper meanings in these patterns, but I know that there are a lot of people out there who make very specific quilts or crochet ones or knit. Like, I don't know how to read that language, so I might just look over it and think, like, oh, that's pretty, that's cool. It took a long time. But I, like, any deeper meaning in the color choice or the pattern is gonna go whoosh.
Right. And there'll always be culture to, there's, different, genres in video games, I'm gonna say. It's like, I don't get it. I play a lot of video games. We'll get to it at a different point. That's also in the box. It's a discussion of genres, but it's a point of, it's hard for me. It's like, if I don't play that type of video game, me making sense of where the genre lines go, pretty much I can't. It ends up being a blindness for me. But again, if that elevation's in a language I don't speak, then I'm not going to know it, and I'm not going to experience it as elevated. It doesn't mean it's not, though. And my note here is, gatekeeping art for others is elitist, and I don't want to participate in that. And it's true, I don't. Every time I find myself yucking somebody else's yum, I gotta question that, because I have my limited window into the human experience, right? I'm born in the 70s, raised as a Midwestern white person, I'm going to have a specific kind of window that I view the world through, and it's wrong for me to try and say what's elevation or meaningful or messaging for somebody else. And I have a degree in an art. I was trained by an institution, and now as I get older, I am questioning institutions. Some people start that way. I came around the long way. It took me until I had, young people smarter than me teaching me stuff. And I wrote, elitist institutions have gatekept art and art study for centuries, possibly forever. And now, with the advent of the internet and social media, we don't have to let them anymore. We can let them gatekeep their institutions, but we don't have to think that things exist only inside of them. They can't gatekeep life. They can't gatekeep thought. They can't gatekeep experience, because guess what? We're going to have it with or without them. So I wrote down a few things. It's like, take all the art study with a grain of salt. Your feelings matter, and your relationship to art and media is yours. At one point in getting ready for this episode, I was trying to make the argument that, some pop music is elevated and some isn't. And so I tried to think of a couple of examples of things that were possibly not elevated. And when I went to go look at the lyrics for those songs that I thought weren't elevated, I realized that they still kind of were. And I just wasn't looking closely enough. If somebody goes through the act of actually writing a song, producing it, publishing it, and especially if it catches the common vernacular enough to go viral or, make a top list, there's something to that. That doesn't just happen by accident. Not that all pieces are as important as every other piece, but I'm not going to gatekeep anymore as best I can.
Imagine Dragons is very popular for a reason. Have you listened to the lyrics of some of those? When you're not rocking out? Because, they're trying to say something.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. We could get into it a lot deeper, but the thing is a lot of the times when people talk about art, I like to take a much more populist stance on art. And not just because one of my favorite art mediums is one that's not very recognized by the art community. And that's okay. They're missing out. That's all I got to say. Because my life has been greatly enriched by video games, But anyway, there's some other things that I've discovered with life experience about art that my art study didn't give me. One of which was the Sistine Chapel. We went to the Sistine Chapel. What year was that? 2011 we went?
Yeah, I think so.
It was certainly a time.
Yeah.
It was over a decade ago.
Yes. And I'd seen the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in books before we went.
Most people have.
I've seen art, I studied art history, at least one semester of art history anyway. Let me tell you, looking at that picture on the internet or in a book will be a much more detailed look. You will notice so much more about the painting than you can in person. First thing you notice when you get into the Sistine Chapel is it's tiny.
You have been in a room that is larger than the Sistine Chapel.
You may currently be in a room that is larger than the Sistine Chapel.
It is a very likely possibility.
There are lobbies to hotels that are larger than the Sistine Chapel.
Oh, by far.
By far, yeah.
By far, yeah. Most elementary school gymnasiums are larger than the Sistine Chapel. It is. Modern scope and scale, especially in America, for spaces, public spaces, is huge compared to centuries-old locations.
Yeah.
They just build bigger now than they ever contemplated when engineering didn't allow it, for one thing.
Yeah, when you look at the Sistine Chapel and, with the context of the time, it's big. And the ceiling, making it do that is impressive.
Yes. Indeed. And I know that the purpose of the Sistine Chapel was not to be big. It was supposed to be, the private chapel of the Pope, which is why it had this impressive ceiling painted in it. But when we were there, we had to stand in a long line, and we were ushered into this humongous crowd, and the only thing I really remember about the whole experience, Silencio! Is a guard shouting, Silencio, over and over again. It's hard to feel awe when you're standing in a line like you're at an amusement park, weaving back and forth while you're being shouted at. Yeah, I didn't get much out of going into the Sistine Chapel. I felt like Good Will Hunting lied to me.
It's typically portrayed with this quiet, insightful feeling, and then you get there, and then there's somebody desperately trying to aggressively enforce it and just can't.
Yeah, because, the crowd is just humming. There's so many people whispering about looking at this art, and so much whispering that me with sensory issues cannot... I just can't.
No, it was overwhelming. It's I don't discourage you from going if you get the chance, But be prepared for it not to be the awe-inspiring experience that you might have thought you were going to have. Instead, on that same trip, a few weeks later, we went to Zagreb, the capital of Croatia. And while we were there, we went to, I think it's called I don't remember the exact title, I'll put it in the blog though. We went to an art gallery in Zagreb. They have a style of art that is uniquely Croatian. They call it naive art. And it has a few different styles. There's a whole section of artists that they did these interesting things like paint on glass in layers that built up, starting from foreground to background, kind of like you do with watercolor.
Yeah, but on glass.
But on glass, yeah. And I'm pretty sure they use oil on glass. And it's just the way that these paintings end up, I don't know, they just have a different relationship to light. They just feel so much different. It feels like they're all super glossy. And none of these paintings in this style are photorealistic. There are some representative elements in them, like you'll know it's a landscape. They're not, well, there's an abstractness to them, but they're not deliberate distortions. And, I don't know. It's hard. I'll link, at least if I can still find it. They still have their website up. You can see a lot of the paintings that are in there. But it was really cool to go into this little art gallery. We were the only people in there. The lady, who was there working was shocked to see an American family walk in. I think they normally only get Croatians in there. But she was more than happy. So when you go to these little museums in other countries, you get your very own tour ride. They are so excited to show you all about it. We had the same experience going to Costa Rica and going to the little zoos they have there. Oh yeah, if you go to a zoo in Costa Rica, they might take animals out of the cages for you so you can touch them.
Yeah, can you tell that we are decently traveled?
Well, we were at one point. That was a phase in our life. Now we barely leave the house. Anyway.
Yeah, yes, it comes and goes. It's a wave. Maybe.
Maybe.
But speaking of local galleries, I've participated in some local galleries in the area that I live in, because I don't know if you guys know this, but I am an artist, not just digital. I have created many paintings which adorn the walls that currently surround us.
I love living in an art gallery.
I could bump some of these by accident if I'm not careful. That's how surrounded we are.
Yeah.
And you've done sculpture, too.
Yeah, I have done sculpture. It doesn't click quite as much with me because it's messy and hard. It's hard to get things to stand up and be flat on the bottom. But yeah, so I've dabbled in quite a few physical mediums, and so I have actually connected with my local art scene. They have this organization that you can join and then display your art in galleries or on their online shows these days, because COVID changed a lot. So yeah, this was actually in 2019 that I joined, so it was right before all the lockdowns and stuff, and I was regularly displaying my art in some local galleries and going and hanging out at the openings every month, and just enjoying, not just seeing other people's expression, but also getting to talk to them and admire each other's art together and ask about it and hear about its creation. Because I think that's something online can get really drowned out, is actually hearing the process of something's creation. Sure, there are TikToks of speed paints or other drawings, but that's different from actually talking to somebody who made something very, very different, this aspect of community.
And I really appreciate the space for raw expression that indie or, very local art can have. Because there's some of that stuff you're never going to see anywhere else. People will be doing things that you can't do commercially or are not important enough. I'm putting important in quotes, because it's, again, that's a subjective line and we shouldn't be gatekeeping each other. But, it's not important enough work for people to put in a gallery show.
Yeah, for these shows, a lot of the time they're like, yeah, you have to put a price on it for it to be sold. Like, how much would it take for somebody to buy this from you? And one of these pieces that was in display in these local galleries was, like, this tapestry that I love it. It's in, like, black and white and red and has, like, lots of X's all over it. And it was priced at, like, $500,000 because the artist did not want to sell it. It's like, that's how much you'd have to pay to take this from me. And, like, that's a lovely, lovely statement.
If you want this, you'll have to buy it from my cold, dead hands.
No, you'll have to feed my cold, starving hands.
But anyway, the major point that I wanted to hit in this episode was, one, don't keep yourself out of your own understanding of art. Don't gatekeep yourself out of making art or thinking that you can't make art. You don't have to even show it to anybody for it to exist. And becoming comfortable with your own expression can be so empowering.
Yeah, and, like, if you're having trouble with that, sometimes seeing other indie art can really help with that. Like, when you only see these really funded productions, you can kind of feel small and like, oh, I could never do that. And it's like, sure, maybe you can never do that, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't make something.
The key is just to, not consider the value judgment as a binary. It's like you might never make something that's carries the sort of importance that other artwork is given, but it does not mean what you create is not valuable in its own way.
Yeah, like, I believe in these galleries I was the only person who did digital works in the way that I do, and I, at the time, actually printed some of my digital works onto canvas and displayed them in the galleries, and they were all, like, fascinated, like, how did you get your digital work onto the canvas? And I'm like, oh, yeah, I bought it through this site, you know? Like,
yeah. But
I went to Costco.
Yeah, I went to Costco.
Yeah. And that's the thing, too, is your local community of artists will teach you tips and tricks of how to do those kinds of things. Like, the Costco Photo Center is a wonderful resource for a lot of Americans.
Yeah, yeah.
I know lots of people that not even necessarily artists, that have the art in their home as pictures that they took, that they had professionally printed in the ways that artists do. Because we have access to that. We could do it. But where those resources are, you can sometimes only find through your local community, and the community building is such a huge part of the expression. So, the main point, art's a big umbrella. It can include anything.
Including an umbrella.
Yes! Oh, absolutely. There's been lots of art involving umbrellas.
It's like, if a bird takes a dump on an umbrella that's being hit by a beautiful sunset, it's like...
Yes, thank you for burning this image into my brain that did not need to be there in this massive work of vocabulary art.
So, anyway, don't sell yourself short. Enjoy art. Let's try not to gatekeep each other and share. That's the big thing, is like, please share your enthusiasm and your passion. And that's exactly what we're going to do next episode. We're each going to talk about a game, hopefully.
We're also going to talk about games in general as uppercase A art.
Yeah, elevated art. Things that we found deeper messages and meaning in that touched us. We've been moved.
Yeah, the kind of stuff that's there with a jagged uppercase A that you can cut yourself on and bleed ideas.
What? No! Please! Okay. Please only do this metaphorically.
Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. Please do leave us some comments, leave us some feedback. We love reading your comments. Thank you so much.
If there's anything interesting in your local art scene, like, either tell us about it or go see it. Go see it.
Yes.
Please.
Oh, yeah. And one of the best resources in your area might be, if you have a local college, they probably have a free art gallery you can go to. Visiting art that other people are doing doesn't have to cost a lot of money either, but I encourage you to go see art if you can. Lots of different kinds. But anyway, thank you for joining us. This has been Collab Not Multiplayer. I'm Giggleklutz.
I'm Honeyshuckleex.
And I'm Sackbot Barbecue.
Goodbye!
Bye!